mockery of Ishmael and Hagar against Sarah and Isaac is playing out again, and it has to do with law people mocking grace people for not doing enough, for not looking the part. There's kind of like, oh, you simple Christians who just believe in Jesus alone. Like, we do more. Of course we believe in Jesus too, but look at our lives.
Welcome to the RedTree Pod, a project aimed at seeing how grace clarifies our otherwise confusing lives and attempts at reading the scriptures. I'm your host, Davis Johnson, and in just a few moments, I'll be joined by my co-hosts, Chris Wachter and Laura Reines. As every other week, we walk through a few passages in light of the gospel before looking at a "but what about" part of the Bible that seems to fly in the face of grace, but maybe doesn't. We're glad to have you with us. Well, another day and another opportunity to believe the tremors and rumblings of God's grace are true and that everything changes in light of them. And that's what we try to do here on the RedTree Pod. I'm joined today again by my friends Chris and Laura. Friends, it's good to see your faces on my screen. What's been happening in your real life, though, since I saw you last?
Well, the Wachters just got back from Florida, including one crazy long day at Disney Magic Kingdom. So it's been about 15 years since Aletha and I and our two older kids had been. Our youngest daughter had never been. So we are grateful now in their teenage years. We're grateful for a chance to go. That they'll probably remember this. At least the older two will remember a lot of this. So
how does the magic compare 15 years later? Is it still
I'd
there?
say it's maybe a little diminished. I think there's always. I think the older you get, the more you're like,
Walt.
This felt a little more magical in my early 30s, and probably a lot more magical when I was 13 myself, which is the first time I came. But my sister Jill is a Disney person, a Disney crazy person in a good way. She loves it, and she actually kind of ran our app from here. So Disney has an app in terms of getting you can pay a bit extra to get into these lightning lane things. I don't know if you guys know this. And so, but you have to kind of be on the app and getting kind of, just being on it, have it right in front of you at the right time to get in these kind of fast lanes, basically. And so she kind of ran point on that from Minneapolis, and we're down there. She signed in on the app from our account, of course, and just graced us with that gift. It was almost like we, paid for a Disney consultant, which we didn't pay, but she gave us that kind of Disney consultant kind of thing. I'm sure people do that. I'm guessing there are people out there who say
that could be a
hey,
job.
I'll do that for a day for you. I'll just sit here at home and get you on these rides.
If it's not a thing, Jill's got to make it a thing. I mean,
she probably should.
Absolutely.
She would
designated
be great at it.
Disney person, right?
Yep.
That was her title that
totally.
we have. Yeah.
And she was otherwise just really helpful with other details, like you should do this or go to this place to eat or, whatever. It was pretty great. So I'm super thankful for her. But anyway, we had a great time. Good to be home, but it was fun. So, but how about you guys? How are things in the land of Davis and Laura?
Well, basically, I also am in a fairy tale world, but not as fun. We had a roof inspector out today, and he was supposed to be here for about a half an hour. Just go up there, take a peek around, come down, tell me what's going on, because we had a mysterious brown spot appear on our ceiling in the living room. It was right. Oh yeah, no, we just kind of like, can we just ignore it and make it go away, or do we have to be an adult about this? But we had him out and we were hoping it was just a small thing, but he was up on our roof for maybe 2 hours. And the longer he was up there, I could just see the dollar bills just adding up. So yeah, sure enough, he came down and let us know what's up. And it's, we won't be going to Disney as a family anytime soon.
There goes the Disney fund.
The Disney budget is,
It was just unfortunate. It's just one of those things where as the deeper he dug, the more rot he found. And I was like, this is a very good grace, picture of but also more expensive.
That I'm not willing to hear right now. All right? I'm plugging my ears. This is more Sinai than it is New Covenant.
So rot is bad? Rot's bad in the roof? Is that what you said?
Apparently,
Is that a bad
like
thing,
I was
or?
like, no, look at how you can like spring on that. That's fun. It's like a trampoline. Come on. Yeah. So that's going to be our reality probably that we get to take care of this summer. But, thankful that we have some kind of a roof over our head at this point, and we'll just take it step by step.
Oh, man.
Sorry to hear that.
That is rough. That actually reminds me, we just got an assessment back on our house, thanks to the local government saying, you know what, your house is actually went up by $70,000 since last year, and we're like, what? We literally did nothing in this last year, and I know the economy is doing its own thing, but it's not doing $70,000 when we're doing nothing. And so I called a guy, and apparently we had filled out a survey. Without knowing, giving him some of the updates we had done on the house. And the survey itself had like this is due by here. And we just didn't double click on like who's sending this and why. It just looked so like you have to fill this out. And it was just one of these instances of like, what were we doing? Because I even tried to argue with the guy of like, come on, we didn't even do anything. And he's like, well, your survey says you got new countertops and new appliances. And I was like, oh. Yeah, that sounds like something we said.
Right.
So, so I want Chris's money spent. I want to go to Disney and not spend money on things we already have. Lord, I'm with you. That's
next
something.
time.
Next time we'll go to Disney. We'll go to Disney with Chris, and Chris is buying.
Absolutely. I think that's the moral of this story.
It sounds like a lot, but okay.
Be a giver, Chris. Be a giver.
But okay. Yeah.
But okay. Oh, fine. Well, we got some fun passages today in the Old Testament. We're going to be talking about Micah 5 and specifically drilling into verses 10 to 13 before turning the page to Psalm 142, which is a psalm that has a counter psalm, but more on that in a little bit. Not a quartz countertop psalm like what the government knows about my kitchen now. In the New Testament, we're going to look at Ephesians 3. We're in the second half of that, verses 14 to 21. And then our But What About passage is a fun one. We're in the first book of the Bible, in Genesis. Chapter 21, a strange scene where God seems to deal harshly with a single mom and her child. And so, especially as we're thinking about grace and how does it work in the Bible, how do you make sense of this scene of Hagar and her son being sent out away from life and sustenance and access to these good things? So we'll talk more about that at the end of today's episode. Before we do, let's begin with Micah. Now, Micah is a prophet, just like, a lot of the prophets that we have in the Old Testament. All of these individuals kind of center around the exile. So you can locate each of the prophets, Micah being one of them, as how they relate to when God is going to bring in the Babylonians and the Assyrians to rule over Israel. So you can locate that as like is this prophet being written before that happens? Is he writing during the exile, or is he writing after the exile? And Micah is one that happens beforehand. And so he's going to have a lot of warnings, and he's going to be litigating under the old covenant, meaning he's going to use Moses and the law and go, here's how you guys are not measuring up. You're infracting upon the law over and over and over again. But within every prophet, and especially as time goes on, especially once you kind of get into the exile and after, more and more you see these prophets begin to use language that they themselves don't even understand, according to the New Testament. I believe that's in 1 Peter 1, where they're like, hey, even the prophets long to have access to the things you now have access to. But the thing that they describe is God is going to change things. God is going to change you and your circumstances in a way that's different than the law. And if you think about just litigation in general, like modern litigation, like how do you actually change society and change people? Mm-hmm. The best thing we can offer from a litigation standpoint is just control. Like we just want to change the way people are operating. So we'll just add some laws, change the way and change the number of lanes on a highway, change the ways that people can talk. But it all has to do with control. And in the prophets, you get this sense of something beyond just God coming down to control us. There's some type of mysterious way in which he's going to change people that looks different than litigation. And Micah is no different. We get that from him. And let me just read verses 10 through 13, and then we can talk about kind of, hey, what are you guys seeing in here from especially more of that RedTree New Covenant grace lens? So it says this: "In that day, declares the Lord, I will destroy your horses from among you and demolish your chariots. I will destroy the cities of your land and tear down all your strongholds. I will destroy your witchcraft, and you will no longer cast spells. I will destroy your idols and your sacred stones from among you. You will no longer bow down to the work of your hands."
Yeah, I feel like I'll just pick it up here,
Yeah.
guys.
Do it.
Yeah, I think it's very forward-telling, like you were saying, Davis, and it doesn't feel like that. It feels like a very Old Testament imagery kind of violent thing that's happening. But if we see what he's talking about right at the end there, and it says, "You shall bow down no more to the work of your hands." Right before that, it's talking about idols, and usually kind of that's where my head goes to when he's talking about Old Testament works of hands. There's a lot of talk throughout the Old Testament narrative about idols and the worshiping of idols, and God is always going on about how he doesn't want them to do that. But if you stretch that up into the entire passage that you read, Davis, we are talking about horses and chariots. We're talking about cities and strongholds, sorceries from your hand, the future tellers, and then come those images, those carved images and the pillars that they would actually bow down and worship to. And it's all of these things. It's all encompassing that he's going to be kind of cutting out from them. It's really violent imagery that we're getting with him kind of tearing this out. But if we think about that and we kind of allow ourselves to step away from like, this is just talking about the Israelites and those pesky little idols that they always tried to worship, and think about what he's actually doing. And he's pulling them away from any kind of works-based protection, really. You have chariots and horses, cities, strongholds. What were soothsayers and fortune tellers, if not like, let me know the future so I can protect myself from it? And he's kind of cutting that all out from him pretty violently in order, like you were saying, Davis, to make way for something different that's coming down the road. And that different thing is Jesus, who at the end of the day will be cut. In order that we can transition from the works of our hands to try and get in the favor of God to now the works of his hands, the cuts on his body, to be there freely without having to kind of scrabble in the dirt all the time.
Yeah, just to maybe second that, I love how positive of a view God through Micah has on good news. A time is coming when you'll no longer bow down to what you've done and to what you've made, good things. We don't tend to think about that as like the epitome of good news. And yet the Bible, the prophets here are picking up on this, that the new era is going to have much less to do with you than you think and much more to do with God. It's going to be different, like you were saying, Davis, different than the old way in the old system, which is more of a handshake with God type way of thinking and living, kind of a meet in the middle or a conference table type way of thinking about religion, where God needs our help or we need a little bit of advice from him, but that's kind of it. But much more based on the works of our hands. And so when Micah speaks up here, he really hits on that. And also, like, kind of around that, you see things like you're saying, Laura, witchcraft and idolatry and horses and cities that are basically prophetic synonyms for the idea of works. I think of like the Psalms where it says they pit trusting in horses against trusting in God. Horses were like tanks of the day, basically. They were that advantageous in battle. And so are we trusting in ourselves and our horses, horse tanks, basically our abilities, our weaponry, or are we trusting in God alone? And that kind of becomes this big ebb and flow or kind of give and take between Israel and God in the Old Testament. And you see, of course, the latter idea always went out. It's God alone who's going to fight your battles. And when you seek to add to it, things go awry. But what I like is the mention of cities, especially. You see in verse 11, I will destroy the cities of your land. But there's no mention of God destroying rural areas. And I think that's significant. This is this is the passage in verse 2 of chapter 5 where we read this at Christmas, this promise of, "But you, Bethlehem Ephratah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times," speaking of Jesus ahead of time. And so I think you had this idea of that God will come against cities, not because he's against actual cities, but he's against what they represent. And that is the works of our hands. He's against the Tower of Babels. He's against the temples that people built with their hands. He's against this system of living with him, in covenant with him, that has to do with us and our law-keeping abilities. And so I like to say that there's this theologically rural emphasis on the coming New Testament era, that Jesus himself would come out of a podunk town of Bethlehem. He would live in Nazareth, where the Bible says nothing good comes out of there. It's this forgettable area. In other words, not associated with our obedience and our law-keeping abilities. The New Testament will be decidedly rural theologically in that regard, so that we can't look at it and say, look, Jesus is coming out of something we've done. He's coming out of something we've built, something out of what we can take pride in and magnify when it comes to our abilities. Instead, he's coming out of not that. He's coming out of a vacancy, a hole, not our expectations, so that we can only look at this and say, God is doing something completely by his grace to save us, that we can't link arms with. We can't point to and say, we can contribute to this as well. And so Micah's prophecy here is just beautiful, and how it helps us understand the Bible actually as well, so that when we see cities and temples and witchcraft and horses and how God's against that, what we're actually reading is that God is going to send his son apart from the works of our hands to save us and to make a New Testament in light of it.
And that grabs us, I think, like it gets a hold of our heart and changes the direction of where we're heading. Again, if you compare that to like, what does litigation do to you? What does the formation of laws? Probably create some form of retaliation. I mean, that's certainly the story of the whole Old Testament is like, how does it go living under law? Well, things move from bad to worse to exile and death, right? It's just like that. And in our own lives, I think we experience that. Don't tell me what to do. I don't like it when you do that. But the promises are always given with this, like, there's something that's going to happen to you that's going to make you want instruction or something better than what you're able to find. And so even though there's violence that's being dedicated towards these things like cities and chariots and your very idols themselves, you got to zoom out and go like, well, how does God actually do that? Does he commit acts of violence towards cities so that he's like, hey, stop it, right? Like, stop going to work in a tower. I destroyed it. Now you have to work from home, right? Or like go to a rural city. No, he redirects that violence onto his son, who dies and then rises again. And those who see it, those who are given access to like see and hear the significance of this, their hearts change within them and they want to receive instruction. They want to worship something beyond that which their hands can create. And that's the new thing. This is the difference, that God is not controlling us with litigation, that the way he rules is by offering something better than what idols can give us. And so we turn from them gladly. We throw them into the middle, or like that scene in Revelation at the end of the book when we're rewarded for that which we've done, and then we just take the reward and we throw it in the middle like, oh, this is nothing compared to what I have with God as my portion. And that's just fantastic news. Even when our money is being spent on roofs and appreciating homes that we didn't want to have change. Right, Laura? Shout out to the government. All right, let's talk about Psalm 142. This is a fun one. I didn't know. We were talking a little bit before we hopped on this call. I just had never known that the context of Psalm 142 is the exact same as Psalm 57. This is David is writing both of these Psalms. Why are they spread apart? That's a question for another time. So far, there's like so many chapters in between. Why wasn't it Psalm 57 and Psalm 58? I don't know. But what I do know is that both of them were written with him in the cave, and they sound diametrically opposed. Like they are so different. Psalm 57 is this just God. David is writing about this cave while Saul is pursuing him, and he's praising God for this cave. And it's this picture of God's protection of him, and how God's got his back, and he is safe in this cave that God provided. But now when we read Psalm 142, it's like David has short-term amnesia and he forgets everything he had just said about this cave as protection. And instead, this cave is this pit of despair. And he's wondering, where is God? I cry out to you and I just feel so abandoned and alone. And there is great theology to be found in this dichotomy. And I'm sure we'll talk plenty about it. But before we do, I want to just read. It's short. I think it's like 7 verses. So let me just read Psalm 142. And again, positioning it in context with the other Psalm, that of 57. It says this: I cry aloud to the Lord. I lift up my voice to the Lord for mercy. I pour out before him my complaint. Before him I tell my trouble. When my spirit grows faint within me, it is you who watch over my way. In the path where I walk, people have hidden a snare for me. Look and see, there is no one at my right hand. No one is concerned for me. I have no refuge. No one cares for my life. I cry to you, Lord. I say, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. Listen to my cry, for I am in desperate need. Rescue me from all who pursue me, for they are too strong for me. Set me free from my prison, that I may praise your name. Then the righteous will gather about me because of your goodness to me. So what do you guys make of Psalm 142?
Yeah, I think it's helpful, especially like Davidic Psalms, to kind of remember his life, right, that we get in the narrative part of the Old Testament. And he is constantly, for the first part of his life, he's constantly butting up against Saul, who that kind of partnership ends up being a great way to see that dichotomy between law and grace. They kind of both serve that typological purpose to kind of help us unpack what's going to happen later on in the biblical narrative. And I think that we see that here. We have David hiding in a cave, and he is really put out with Saul kind of out there waiting for him. And you can hear it in verses 5 through 7. And he's saying, I cry out to you, Lord. I say, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. And then he goes on and he says, attend to my cry, for I am brought very low. Deliver me from my persecutors, for they are too strong for me. And so if we kind of put this up against or underneath that typological umbrella that Saul and David normally kind of represent, then we can see that the law, this like works-based mantra, is making it very, very hard for David. He's saying, deliver me from my persecutors, for they are too strong. And that is our truth. The law is too strong. We cannot overcome it. We cannot be perfect under it. We cannot walk through it and be alive, basically. And he's saying, bring me out of prison. And that's what the law ends up being for the Israelites right after they get it. Like it becomes this type of slavery that they had just been released from in Egypt. And now they're kind of in this new set of prison bars, basically. And so when you hear David cry out, specifically when he's kind of coming up against Saul, it is helpful to kind of unpack it underneath that typology so we can kind of see the two epochs, basically, of the Bible running up against each other. But then we know the ending because Jesus is coming, and he's coming as the better David, who will, the Saul law, that's a good way to say it, is going to give way to this new and better David.
Tupac to epoch. It's the Christian spin on Tupac. We're to epoch. You got a rap future with that name.
Thank you.
I'm excited.
I was actually, this is my self-promoting. I just released my first album.
To epoch.
So many new phrases coming at me today.
And you're sponsoring us to go to Disney. Don't forget.
Yeah. Let's go. Yep. Tomorrow. Everyone's hop along. Yeah, I love that posture too, Laura, of the desperation and they are too strong for me. I mean, I think even just this morning, I've probably seen a dozen memes or, Instagram posts or commercials or whatever, radio spots that have said the opposite, that nothing's too strong for you if you just set your mind to it. If you just try a little bit harder and get back in the game and dust yourself off, like you can you can do it. And it's so refreshing, to have a different word that you really don't hear anywhere else in the world. Like the word of grace is so distinctly Christian. It's so distinctly biblical. And little prayers like this are humbling, but good for the soul. And I think the prayer of a true believer, is I'm not strong. And when I am, it's when I'm in God or when I'm being helped by him. So also just to point out verse 5, you are my refuge, my portion. I think that's just a helpfully hermeneutical thing that David is doing here by saying God is actually my allotment. The word portion is a word you see in the Old Testament for the segments of land that all the tribes of Israel got when they entered into the land behind Joshua. And so for here to see portion or inheritance basically kind of likened to God himself is a very forward pointing thing. He's being a kind of a bridge in between the types or the images, the historical instances of the Old Testament and the fulfillments, which is Jesus. So when Jesus himself says, I am your portion in the New Testament and refers to himself in those terms, like I think that becomes this kind of final goal or finish line to what David is starting to get at, that really what the land was always about all along is God himself. And to be in the land, to be truly in this place of milk and honey, to be truly in this place of a tropical paradise, a new Eden, is to be saved by Jesus from our sins and to be one with him in spirit. And so David here talks like a New Testament believer, you could say, in a sense, but helps us understand the Bible along the way by interpreting portion in a Christological manner.
Yeah, just to close a loop on these two Psalms, or specifically, like, how do you read it? I mean, that's just so wild that he's just so happy and excited, and then he's like, I'm abandoned, I'm alone. I mean, first brush is like, this gives you a lot of permission in your own life, that your spiritual life is a lot of ups and downs. And the very same thing can be this great source of refuge and reminder, can then feel like this on the opposite side of like, I'm reminded that I feel alone and abandoned. And so that's actually par for the course when it comes to following Jesus, that life is just uphill a lot of the times. And I mean, any of the good gifts you have, like I think of a really good friendship, it can feel like this amazing gift from God. And then all of a sudden you have some conflict with that friend and you just feel like, God, where are you in this? Right? It just, Psalm 57 and 142 can be a blueprint for what your life is going to look like. But more than this, like we like to say a lot with RedTree related things, before this is about you, it is about Jesus. And the very pit of deliverance that we receive, that we can cry out and actually say Psalm 57 back to God, is because Psalm 142 was Jesus' experience on the cross. And in fact, the last verse of Psalm 142, which says, set me free from my prison, that I may praise your name, then the righteous will gather about me because of your goodness to me. This was Jesus' prayer in the garden that went unanswered by God. Set me free from having to do this thing. Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. Because Jesus heard no to this prayer from God the Father in the garden, now every time we pray this prayer in light of Jesus, we get to see him as God's cosmic yes because of his ultimate deliverance for us. Because he received the door in his face, that door is always open to us, which is amazing news and allows us to see him probably in a fresh way in reading Psalm 142 than if we're just stuck in our own experiences. And again, it offers plenty for us in our own experiences. But when you see it as Jesus's words themselves, or the song that Jesus himself is singing, it does just offer some more color to these words. Well, let's turn back now to Ephesians 3. And if you haven't heard the song from Back to the Future in a while, basically as I read Ephesians 3, you're going to hear Hewy Lewis in the news singing The Power of Love. That is the power of love. You can already hear, you feel it in the background, don't you? The dun 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 dun. All right. Well, with that,
Paul must have been listening to it when he wrote.
I think so.
Ephesians 3,
or Two Epoch. The rapper. I think these are his lyrics. Maybe
Probably.
Paul is the original. One Epoch. Two Epoch.
Yeah.
Here's the words. Oh man, at the risk of getting back on track, let me read these words. It says this: for this reason, I kneel before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth derives its name. I pray that out of his glorious riches he may strengthen you with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. And I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power, together with all the Lord's holy people, to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ, and to know this love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. Now to him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work within us, to him be glory in the church and in Christ Jesus throughout all generations, forever and ever. Amen. What do you guys got for Ephesians 3, 21, or 14 to 21?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of love just the idea of this power that Paul is talking about. He actually talks about it right at the beginning of Ephesians 2 in the first chapter. And at that point, he's talking about this power that is working towards us, this power of God that's coming towards us. And now he's talking about this power of God that is working within us. And I just love that progression, because I feel like we can start it even back into the Old Testament, because we were running up against that power in the Old Testament. And now Jesus has come and he's come towards us. That power has come towards us. And now he's at work within us. And I think it's so important that we don't break that progression, because we want to bring the God of the Old Testament, the creator God, this God who works these miracles, and we want to make sure we don't cut him off from this power that Paul is talking about and just how magnificent that is. It's the dead raising power. It's the chain breaking power that is now residing within us. And I think it's just super wonderful to be able to maintain that and just remember that as we go about our daily lives.
But it might just save your life. Is that what you're saying? That's the power
of
love. Dun, 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 dun.
I gotta go, guys.
We hit the breaking point. We found it. It was Hewy Lewis in the news. That was Laura's breaking point.
Yep. Wow. Learning more about Paul here as well, who was a fan, obviously, of the great trilogy, Back to the Future.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's great, Laura. I agree. It's this passage has always been for me kind of just a helpfully recentering thing on what it looks like to live a normal Christian life, which you don't graduate from the love of God. We don't ever get to a point where we get it, and that is. I think, like, if you ask yourself or any, Christian, like, get them in a corner, they're going to acknowledge that. But in terms of actually believing that in the heart, and practicing that, I think is a whole different thing. And just how quickly we are to shelve the gospel, the love of God for us in the scars and wounds of Jesus Christ, to shelve that and to move on to what we might consider advanced Christianity. But Paul here, writing to this first century church, doesn't bite. He says, actually, what I really pray for you, what I really want as your pastor from afar, is to go deeper into what you already know, to go deeper into the love of God, into the wounds of Jesus, to place your hands more into his side. And I think from there, that's where true change and maturity and growth and your own love for other people comes from. It's not from the law that says love people better, love your neighbor, love God, or else. Which is more of that law threat that you were talking about before, Davis. But instead, we find that change comes from the Spirit. It comes from believing. I think even in Galatians somewhere, Paul says, are you seeing miracles among you by works of the law or by believing what you heard? Like, is God working miracles among you by your obedience to the law, or simply by your belief of the gospel? And it's clearly the latter. Like, it's through belief. It's through our weakness and our open hands. And like David saying, I'm not able to overcome my sin on my own. I'm not able to follow God's standards. I need God to do something altogether different, a la Micah 5, right? Where Micah's picking up on this and saying that era is coming. But then picking up in verses 20 and 21 too. Now to him who's able to do more than we ask or imagine. I just love that statement as well too, where I think to me that just says that God is always living in the space of doing more than we can ever ask, in the space that's beyond us and beyond our ability to understand and conceive, and in this space that's beyond our works and our wisdom. So that we're always in this place of receiving from him, receiving from the unknown, receiving from the hands of another. and not just trying to kind of match this up with our abilities to kind of like meet God right where he is. Like he's always going to be above that. So we're in this place of reception and not of climbing and impressing him and things like that. So Paul then says, I'm not here to flatter you. That's a big word for Paul. I didn't come with words of flattery, but I came with words of power from the Spirit, and words about Christ alone, not of your amazingness.
Well, let's turn to the "but what about" passage for today. And again, we're in Genesis 21, specifically verses 8 to 21. Little context for this. God had given Abraham and Sarah a promise that they were going to have a kid, even though they were way beyond the childbearing possible years. And not only is it a promise for a kid, it's a promise for offspring that's going to be as numerous as the stars. And they hear this. Sarah hears this and laughs. And eventually they conspire together to help God out by involving a third party in having this child that God promised them. So they have the servant woman Hagar sleep with Abraham, and Ishmael is born. And in that process, Hagar and Sarah get a little feisty with one another. And specifically, Hagar kind of starts to feel pretty chummy towards Sarah, of just like, look it, I was able to have a kid and you're not. And I'm going to remind you of that. And it finally gets to the point where Hagar and Ishmael are actually told that they need to leave the camp. And it wasn't just like Sarah being like, I'm just fed up with hearing from you. It was actually God telling Abraham and Sarah, she's got to go. And so it brings all sorts of theological questions of like, how could God be so harsh, especially towards this single mom that was in a situation that was way beyond her power and was just doing what she was told. So how then do you make sense of this passage, especially when we're saying, you know, if you really want to unlock all of the Bible, read it in light of Christ and his grace, and specifically seen in the gospel. So how do you make sense of this? What do you guys do with Genesis 21 verses 8 to 21?
This passage is a tricky one. I mean, I'm sure it is for you too, but also just as a woman and as a mother, this is a hard pill to swallow, to see God act like this towards, like you were saying, a single mother, basically. And then if you read the account, you know, she's in the wilderness and her, you know, Ishmael is crying under a bush. Like it's not like I'm just going to go to the town next door. Like they were banished kind of unto death until God intervenes. So it's that, how do you place that in the rest of your faith, which we've been talking about, how merciful God is and how he runs towards us. And I think it's really helpful to remember that the Bible is not, at the end of the day, a history book. The point of the Bible is not to just tell us what happened. The point is to tell us about God and to tell us about how he's moving in our lives, in our history, in our world, and how that movement is always towards us. And so if we can kind of pull back and pull just like, this is what happened, and now we just go on to the next story, and just sit in the discomfort a little bit, I think we would be surprised to see that maybe more is happening in this story than just a woman being banished. Like we talked about with David and Saul, there are a lot of pairs in the Bible that end up serving as a typological comparison between grace and law, between Sinai and Jesus coming in. And Hagar and Sarah definitely play that role, but also Isaac and Ishmael do. And I think it's really interesting because I feel like God, as the author of the Bible, starts to make this pretty clear the closer that we get to this particular story. Because if you read back a little bit, you will see that Ishmael starts becoming just the boy a little bit behind this. He is not named by his actual name in this account at all. The last time that we see him called Ishmael is actually right after Isaac's birth is promised. And Abraham kind of comes back at God and he says, but wait, like, what about Ishmael? He actually says, he's like, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. And then the next verse, and God said, no. You know, and then he talks about Isaac's birth, but it's very like, no, It's not an maybe, we'll see how it plays out. Like, God is very adamant before Isaac's born that Isaac is going to be the bearer of the covenant. But he does go on and he say, as for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him, and I will make him fruitful and multiply him greatly. So he has this blessing in store for Ishmael. But the point of this narrative going forward, as Ishmael kind of becomes less of his own individual person and more as the boy, and then as we read in the story that we're looking at, he's called the son of Hagar the Egyptian, which I think is also very theologically important, considering what Egypt is about to become in the history of the Israelites and therefore in our history. Egypt is just going to, become this huge picture of us being trapped with the law and with sin and death. And obviously the rest of the narrative is to bring us out of that. And so I think that's what's happening right here, is that Isaac and Ishmael are being very purposefully separated. It's not that Ishmael can live in the camp and Isaac is just going to be the one that inherits, but Ishmael's there. We're seeing how they cannot coincide. And as hard as it is to swallow kind of historically, I think it's very important that God is very, very steady and truthful, and he's telling the same thing every time. I think it would be harder then to fit this in with the rest of the narrative if it's just like, everybody gets a bit. We're good. Because what does that mean for us then when it comes to Jesus and our inheritance from him? I think as hard as this is to read, I think it's very important to just keep in mind that this is a theological telling and not a historical one.
Yeah, even though it's obviously historically true, these two people did totally exist. But how does the New Testament read this story? There's a great tool for us that we always want to use whenever something feels confusing or murky or hard to understand. Go to those places where it feels clearer. I mean, this is the church's like baseline interpretive grid, is to use the scriptures to understand the scriptures. And fortunately for us, this is one of those scenes that we have one of the more significant unpackings of theology from the Apostle Paul in the book of Galatians. He says basically when he reads this story, yes, these are two women, but they are also two covenants. They represent two covenants, and they're to be interpreted allegorically. Then he goes like this: Sarah, Abraham's actual wife, is one who resembles or embodies the new covenant of promise, the spiritual Jerusalem. And then Hagar is connected to a covenant of slavery that is labeled under Mount Sinai. So this is like one of these mind-blowing, hold on, what are you saying? He's saying, yeah. When you're in, Genesis 21 and you're reading about Hagar and her being cast out, what you need to do is locate her theologically in the rest of the story. And she is embodying or representing a covenant that God hasn't even made yet, but is already operative in the world under the knowledge of good and evil, that original tree that Adam and Eve ate from. A tree that really sounds like the law, right? Not know what to do and know what not to do. But 400 years from now, God is going to establish Mount Sinai. And yet Paul is going, I know, but you still need to read Mount Sinai into the story and see what's happening. Mount Sinai is being cast out and saying, what I'm bringing in, this new thing, this covenant of promise, that's going to change you in the same way that Chris was describing to us, right? How are you actually being changed? Is it by doing, or is it by believing what you've heard? In that covenant, there is no room for Hagar. There is no room for Mount Sinai. There is no room for you and the work of your hands. I'm not casting the person out. I'm casting the covenant out. I'll take care of the person. In fact, the rest of this story, he does. This is where we get this. It's one of the most, I think it's the first time in the Bible we hear that God is a God who sees. Mm-hmm. And what is he actually seeing? He's seeing Hagar, the person, and her child who is calling out. So God's going to take care of that. He's going to show us his grace. But he wants to clarify grace by showing us what it's not. And he does that by sending this out of the camp. And it has tons of personal application in your life. Like I always get told, well, what are we supposed to do, right? Whenever we actually really clarify and center grace, what am I supposed to do? Do this. Cast out the Hagar in your life. Cast out, and not like the real person, the theology. You have theology that resembles Hagar and Mount Sinai. And God is saying, get that out of your spiritual camp. that no longer belongs here. This whole like you and me, God, handshake theology, God helps those who help themselves. That's got to go. That's got to be cast out of your camp. This is what you are to do in light of the gospel. There's more to be said, though, about the way these two interact, especially in their interpersonal dynamics. And I'd love to hand that over to Chris. I feel like you're somebody who's taught me a lot on the interaction of these two covenants, specifically within the camp.
Yeah, there's this detail in the story where you see a lot of kind of mocking and laughter from Hagar and also from Ishmael, actually, as well. There's kind of a laughter, kind of a mockery, in terms of, I think, how Isaac came to be and just kind of who he was maybe as a person. We're not told a lot, actually, in Genesis, but you do see it, this kind of mockery and laughter. And I think it fits really well, actually, with the context of Galatians, where you have different types of Christians in the church, maybe some false Christians, false teachers as well, but different types of Christians who are operating more towards the kind of the side of grace and others towards more the side of grace plus law. And there's a mockery happening. There's kind of like, oh, you simple Christians who just believe in Jesus alone. Like there's kind of this this downplaying or this self-aggrandizing on their side of things of like, we do more. Of course we believe in Jesus too, but look at our lives. Like we're reading this discipleship curriculum every day, and we're kind of advancing a bit. We're fasting. We're keeping a segment of the law, which is a big part of what these Judaizers were doing and infiltrators of the church that Paul's very angry at. And this is a whole part of the point of the letter. It's why he's bringing this up at all, is that this is replaying itself out. The story of the mockery of Ishmael and Hagar against Sarah and Isaac is playing out again. And it has to do with law people mocking grace people for not doing enough, for not looking the part, for not having as many badges on their arm, for not flexing as much spiritually. And this is playing out. It's been the mantra of humanity since the very beginning. You mentioned the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, Davis. But the whole point of him mentioning this, or one of the main points, not the whole thing, but one of the main points to flow off what you're saying before, Davis, is like, this is about two covenants, but it's also about how they interact. And the big way that presents is a kind of a legalistic mockery of grace-centered Christians who are simply just trying to believe in Jesus and cling to him for, like David in Psalm 142, even as a believer, I am weak and I'm not strong. And I see it every day. But Jesus is sufficient. His grace is sufficient for me. It actually is enough. But that actually, we're going to see that. And we're all going to maybe be on both sides of that sometimes. Even grace-centered Christians are going to play the role of a Hagar sometimes. Just we have to be humble and realize that. But I think the point of this when you read the book and the letters of the New Testament is to see that these stories inform what churches will be like. Churches will struggle. Christians will struggle and jockey and volley between these two sides, these two covenants. And we always have to hear the better word of the New Testament, which says life comes when you're not even trying to produce it. It comes out of nowhere. It comes, like Micah 5 says, like the dew in the morning, where you walk out of your house, your door, and there's dew there, and you haven't done anything to produce it. Micah says that's what salvation is like. That's what you are like. You're like the dew that does not depend on any man or the strength or the will of any person, but simply on God just deciding for it to be. And such was Isaac's birth, and such was the story of our salvation, completely by the hand of God and not by our doing.
When he shall come with trumpet sound.
Thank you for joining us. You can find us online at redtreegrace.com. Audio production for the podcast is provided by Dan Zeller and website support by Nolan Bauer. If you've enjoyed what you've heard, do consider dropping us a rating wherever you get your podcast to join us in giving away the always better news of God's grace. Thanks again for being with us.
On Christ the Son.